This Marco Rubio's brilliant speech left the entire Congress speechless.
Chair Rubio, welcome back to the committee. Love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'll be brief in my opening statement so we can leave more time for questions. I've submitted a written statement, but I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to talk to you guys for a few minutes. And
all right, here we go. Suspend. You know the drill. Off to jail.
That's a war crime.
That's a one-year ban from the committee. Anyone who is a persistent violator will be banned for 3 years. So don't know whether the guy falls in that category. Looks like it. I hope after 3 years he'll find a more productive means of employment. Secretary Rubio, we have 2 hearings a week. You know, you seem to have a more robust following than most of our witnesses that come before us. But anyway.
There'll be a couple more, so thank you for stopping the clock, but I appreciate it. So, and I know there's a lot of other topics you're going to ask me about, so we can talk about those, including the ones that Senator Shaheen just outlined. But let me just talk about Venezuela in particular.
Please.
I think we can talk, if you want. I'm sure your questions will be about what happened before and led up to in the operation. I want to focus my comments this morning on what happens now and moving forward, because you're going to ask about the going back. And let me just say this. What is our goal going in? We had in our hemisphere a regime operated by an indicted narco-trafficker that became a base of operation for virtually every competitor, adversary, and enemy in the world. It was, for Iran, their primary spot of operation in the Western Hemisphere was Venezuela. For Russia, their primary base of operation in the Western Hemisphere, along Cuba and Nicaragua, was Venezuela. In the case of China, China was receiving oil at a huge, about $20 a barrel discount. And they weren't even paying money for it. It was being used to pay down debt that they were owed. This is the oil of the people of Venezuela, and it was being given to the Chinese as barter at a 20%, at a $20 discount per barrel in some cases. And so you had basically 3 of our primary opponents in the world operating from our hemisphere from that spot. It was also a place where you had a narco-trafficking regime that openly cooperated with the FARC and the ELN and other drug trafficking organizations using their national territory. It was an enormous strategic risk for the United States, not halfway around the world, not in another continent, but in the hemisphere in which we all live. And it was having dramatic impacts on us, but also on Colombia and on the Caribbean basin and all sorts of other places. It was an untenable situation, and it had to be addressed. And it was addressed. And now the question becomes what happens moving forward. As I've described to you in previous settings and in individual conversations, we had 3 objectives here. The final, I'll work it backwards, because the end state here is we want to reach a phase of transition where we are left with a friendly, stable, prosperous Venezuela, and democratic, in which all elements of society are represented, and free and fair elections. By the way, you can have elections. You can have elections all day. But if the opposition has no access to the media, if opposition candidates are routinely dismissed and unable to be on the ballot because the government, those aren't free and fair elections. That's the end state that we want. Free, fair, prosperous, and friendly Venezuela. We're not going to get there in 3 weeks. It's going to take some time. And so objective number 1 was stability. In the aftermath of the removal of Maduro, the concern was what happens in Venezuela. Is there civil war? Do the different factions start going at each other? Are 1 million people crossing the border into Colombia? All of that has been avoided. And one of the primary ways that it has been avoided is the ability to establish direct, honest, respectful, but very direct and honest conversations with the people who today control the elements of that nation. Meaning the law enforcement, the government apparatus, et cetera. And one of the tools that's available to us is the fact that we have sanctions on oil. There is oil that is sanctioned that cannot move from Venezuela because of our quarantine. And so what we did is we entered into an arrangement with them. And the arrangement is this. On the oil that is sanctioned and quarantined, we will allow you to move it to market. We will allow you to move it to market at market prices, not at the discount China was getting. In return, the funds from that will be deposited into an account that we will have oversight over. And you will spend that money for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. Why was that important? Venezuela was running out of storage capacity. Okay? They were producing oil, they were drilling oil, they had nowhere to put it. They had nowhere to move it, and they were facing a fiscal crunch. They needed money in the immediacy to fund the police officer, the sanitation workers, the daily operations of government. And so we've been able to create a short-term mechanism. This is not going to be the permanent mechanism, but this is a short-term mechanism in which the needs of the Venezuelan people can be met through a process that we've created where they will submit every month a budget of this is what we need funded. We will provide for them at the front end what that money cannot be used for. And they've been very cooperative in this regard. In fact, they have pledged to use a substantial amount of those funds to purchase medicine and equipment directly from the United States. As in fact, one of the things they need is dilutin, or dilutin, depending how you want to pronounce it. And that basically is the light crude that you need to mix with their heavy crude in order for the oil to be able to be mixed and moved. They used to get 100% of that from Russia. They are now getting 100% of that from the United States. So we're using that short-term mechanism both to stabilize the country, but also to make sure that the oil proceeds that are currently being generated through the licenses we'll now begin to issue on the sanctioned oil goes to the benefit of the Venezuelan people, not to fund the system that existed in the past. The second is a period of recovery. And that is the phase in which you want to see a normalized oil industry. Again, look, we've got plenty of oil. There's plenty of oil all over the world. Canada produces heavy crude, so it's not like Venezuela's oil is unique in that regard, despite the fact they have the largest known reserves in the world. It's not irreplaceable. But we understand that that is the lifeline. Their natural resources are going to allow Venezuela to be stable and prosperous moving forward. And so we have created what we hope to do is transition to a mechanism that allows that to be sold in a normal way, a normal oil industry, not one dominated by cronies, not one dominated by graft and corruption. To that end, the authorities there deserve some credit. They have passed a new hydrocarbon law that basically eradicates many of the Chavez-era restrictions on private investment in the oil industry. It probably doesn't go far enough to attract sufficient investment, but it's a big step from where they were 3 weeks ago. So that's a major change. We can address some of the other components, but I'll run out of time. But one of the parts of the transition phase, or the recovery phase, is beginning to create space for different voices inside of Venezuelan politics to have an ability to speak out. Part of that is the release of political prisoners. By some estimates, up to 2,000. They are releasing them. They are releasing them probably slower than I would like them to, but they are releasing them. And in fact, you're starting to see some of the people being released beginning to speak out and participate in political life in the country. We have a long ways to go. Look, we can talk in more detail about all of these things. Suffice it to say, I'm not here to claim to you this is going to be easy or simple. I am saying that in 3.5, almost 4 weeks, we are much further along on this project than we thought we would be, given the complexities of it going into it. And I recognize that it won't be easy. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we are dealing with people over there that have spent most of their lives living in a gangster paradise. So it's not going to be like from one day to the next, we're going to have this thing turn around overnight. But I think we're making good and decent progress. It is the best plan, and we are certainly better off today in Venezuela than we were 4 weeks ago. And I think and hope and expect that we'll be better off in 3 months, in 6 months, in 9 months than we would have been had Maduro still been there. So thank you.
Before we get started, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below if you think America should never allow China, Russia, and Iran to gain control in our own hemisphere. Marco Rubio just gave one of the clearest and most direct explanations we've heard in Congress about why Venezuela matters to the United States, and why the Trump administration's approach was never just about one country. It was about stopping America's enemies from building a base of operations right in our backyard. And what Rubio said completely destroys the media narrative we've heard for years. Because according to Rubio, Venezuela under Maduro wasn't just some isolated socialist disaster. It had become a strategic hub for nearly every major adversary of the United States. Iran operating in the Western Hemisphere. Russia expanding influence alongside Cuba and Nicaragua. China exploiting Venezuela's oil while ordinary Venezuelans suffered in poverty. That part about China was especially revealing. Rubio explained that China was getting Venezuelan oil at massive discounts, sometimes $20 below market price, and in many cases they weren't even paying cash. They were using Venezuela's own resources to settle debt arrangements while the Venezuelan people got poorer and poorer. Think about how insane that is. A communist regime backed by Beijing was essentially handing over national wealth while the country collapsed economically. And yet for years, many Democrats acted like concerns over Venezuela were exaggerated or somehow disconnected from American national security. Rubio completely dismantled that argument. He framed Venezuela not as some distant foreign problem, but as an immediate strategic threat sitting inside the Western Hemisphere. That matters because America has spent decades warning about hostile powers gaining footholds near U.S. territory. The Monroe Doctrine existed for a reason. The United States has always understood that allowing rival powers to dominate nearby regions eventually threatens American security directly. Rubio's point was simple. This was not happening halfway around the world. This was happening close to home. Then he moved into another issue the media often downplays: narco-trafficking. Rubio described the Maduro regime as openly cooperating with criminal organizations like the FARC and ELN. That means Venezuela wasn't just functioning as an authoritarian government. According to Rubio, it had effectively become a safe operating zone for drug trafficking groups tied to instability throughout Latin America. And again, this impacts the United States directly: illegal drugs pouring into American communities, criminal networks destabilizing neighboring countries, refugee crises overwhelming borders throughout the region. Rubio painted a picture of a government that wasn't merely corrupt, but actively fueling regional chaos. What's interesting is that Rubio didn't spend most of his time relitigating the past. He focused on what happens next. That's where his comments became even more important politically. He laid out the administration's actual strategy in practical terms, instead of the usual vague talking points Washington often gives. Rubio said the ultimate goal is a stable, prosperous, democratic Venezuela with free and fair elections. But he also acknowledged reality. He admitted this kind of transition doesn't happen overnight. That level of realism is something voters are starving for right now. People are tired of politicians pretending massive geopolitical problems can be solved in a weekend press conference. Rubio openly admitted the situation is complicated, dangerous, and fragile. He explained that the immediate concern after Maduro's removal was preventing total collapse. Civil war, mass migration, violence spilling into neighboring countries, economic disaster. According to Rubio, the administration's first priority was stability. And then he described something the media will probably ignore completely: leverage. Rubio explained how sanctions on Venezuelan oil created negotiating power for the United States. Venezuela desperately needed revenue because they were literally running out of storage capacity for their oil production. They needed access to markets. So the administration used that pressure to create a controlled arrangement. Instead of China getting sweetheart deals behind closed doors, Rubio said oil revenues would now move through monitored channels with oversight to ensure the money actually benefits the Venezuelan people and keeps basic government functions operating. Now, whether every part of that plan succeeds long-term is still an open question. Foreign policy is never perfect, but what Rubio demonstrated here was strategic thinking instead of ideological fantasy. That's the difference. For years, Democrats approached many foreign policy issues by hoping adversaries would simply cooperate if America showed enough goodwill. Rubio's speech reflected the opposite philosophy: strength, leverage, pressure, negotiation from a position of power. And politically, that message is going to resonate with a lot of Americans right now, especially because voters increasingly see China as a direct threat economically and strategically. Hearing Rubio explain that China was deeply embedded inside Venezuela's oil system reinforces the broader concern conservatives have been raising for years about Beijing expanding influence across the globe, while weak American leadership allowed it to happen. Rubio also sounded far more informed and detail-oriented than many of the critics attacking these policies from the sidelines. He wasn't speaking in slogans. He was laying out operational realities, economic pressures, regional security concerns, and strategic objectives step by step. That's probably why the hearing room stayed so focused while he spoke. Because whether people agree with every tactic or not, Rubio came across like someone who actually understands the stakes. And there's another thing here that shouldn't be overlooked. Rubio repeatedly emphasized the idea of a friendly Venezuela. That word matters. America cannot afford hostile regimes aligned with China, Russia, and Iran spreading influence throughout Latin America while Washington pretends geography no longer matters. The left often mocks concerns about spheres of influence, but every major power on earth still thinks that way. China certainly does. Russia absolutely does. Iran does too. Rubio's argument is that the United States should stop acting naive while its adversaries aggressively pursue strategic advantage. That's why this speech matters beyond Venezuela itself. It reflects the broader foreign policy debate happening in America right now. Do you confront adversaries early and aggressively, or do you wait until the threat becomes unavoidable? Do you use economic leverage and sanctions strategically, or do you allow rival powers to quietly gain ground while politicians issue carefully worded statements? Rubio clearly believes hesitation created this mess in the first place. And after listening to this speech, a lot of Americans are probably going to agree with him. Because at the end of the day, Rubio wasn't describing some abstract ideological fight. He was describing a battle over whether America will remain the dominant power in its own hemisphere or allow hostile foreign governments to build influence right off our doorstep. And judging by the reaction in that room, even Rubio's critics know that argument is getting harder and harder to dismiss. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit subscribe, like the video, and let me know in the comments. Do you think America waited too long to confront China's growing influence in Latin America?